And there's no,
Not gonna be on the air tonight.
yeah, no video because the computer's at Lester's house, and obviously Lester's at the hospital, and all of his kids are as well. So, but you have been graced with my presence, and that is more than enough. No.
I was wondering if it was going to be called off tonight for whatever reason.
Well, you're prepared though. I mean, you've had time to prepare.
Yeah, I mean, I never was told not to show up, so I just showed up anyway.
Yeah.
So, and I guess we all thought the same thing because we're all here. So
Yeah,
anyway,
yeah.
Okay, so
Chapter 8.
we are in chapter 8. Yes,
Oh, I read chapter 9.
that's the second week in a row you've done
I
that.
know, but I looked at last week's paper and it said chapter 8, so I went, okay, it's chapter 9 this week.
Did last week say chapter 8 on the paper?
Well, I think it did, or I wouldn't have gone to 9. Laying on my couch.
I would not put it past myself given how many typos there are in my handouts.
Oh,
So
I don't know.
we'll just go ahead and read chapter 8, all 14 verses, and then we're going to start out, obviously, I mean, it's on your handout, kind of looking at some similar wording between chapter 8 and chapter 7. But starting in verse 1 of chapter 8, set the trumpet to your mouth, he shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law. Israel will cry to me, my God, we know you. Israel has rejected the good. The enemy will pursue him. They set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. From their silver and gold they made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. Your calf is rejected, O Samaria. My anger is aroused against them. How long until they attain to innocence? For from Israel is even this. A workman made it, and it is not God, but the calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces. They sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no bud, it shall never produce meal. If it should produce, aliens would swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. Now they are among the Gentiles, like a vessel in which is no pleasure. For they have gone up to Assyria, like a wild donkey alone by itself. Ephraim has hired lovers. Yes, though they have hired among the nations, now I will gather them, and they shall sorrow a little, because of the burden of the king of princes. Because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they have become for him altars for sinning. I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing. For the sacrifices of my offerings they sacrifice flesh and eat it. But the Lord does not accept them, nor he will remember, now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. They shall return to Egypt. For Israel has forgotten his maker and has built temples. Judah also has multiplied fortified cities. But I will send fire upon his cities, and it shall devour his palaces. So, yeah, just, looking at your handout, I even color-coded it for you. How nice.
Yes.
Chapter 7, verse 2. It says, they do not consider in their hearts that I remember all their wickedness. Right? I talked about how, even that is sort of an idea influenced by, the pagan religions that they were, that surrounded Israel. It's a very individualistic religion. There wasn't a whole lot of emphasis on corporate guilt or even any sort of moral code that was applied for everyone. It was just sort of, come do what you want, pray, make an offering, whatever, and then leave. Chapter 8, verse 13 has, some similar wording. Now he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. So remembering wickedness, remembering iniquity. Another example, chapter 7, verse 7. They are all hot like an oven and have devoured their judges. All their kings have fallen. None among them calls upon me. So again, chapter 7 last week, we have the constant turnover of kings, and we even went into that quite a bit. And chapter 8, verse 4, it says, they set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I did not acknowledge them, right? So, not only was it bad because, there's no stability and there's this constant turnover of kings. But I mean, the kings, the people taking power were not, ordained by God. They make kings, but not by me. They make princes, but God says, right, I don't even acknowledge them, right? To me, I mean, they're just like any other person, right? They're not even a king in my eyes. Chapter 7, verse 11, it says, they call to Egypt, right? So in addition to this, that we talked about last week, in addition to this constant turnover of power of kings in Israel, you also had a constant change in foreign policy, essentially, right? We'll make an alliance with Assyria. No, wait, now we're going to make one with Egypt. Now we're going to make one with Syria or Aram, and this constant change there. And so it says they call to Egypt, and then chapter 8, verse 13, they shall return to Egypt. So you see that there. Chapter 7, verse 11, it says they go to Assyria. So same verse that I just quoted from with the last example. Again, this constant change in political alliances and foreign policy. Chapter 8, verse 9 says they have gone up to Assyria. So, we see a lot of the same condemnations as we've seen in chapter 7. I mean, the corruption of the kings, the constant turnover of authority, relying on foreign nations and politics instead of relying on God, idolatry and paganism. And we even see some of the same results that we saw in chapter 7, right? Same sin as chapter 7, also the same results, right? The first example that I gave, right? God remembering all the wickedness of corporate Israel. Chapter 8, verse 13, he will remember their iniquity and punish their sins. So we see a lot of the same condemnation of sin, a lot of the same results of that sin. But, and then this is your fill in the blank, there is a unique result of Israel's sin that we see here in chapter 8, and that is returning to Egypt, right? The language that's used in chapter 7 when it says calling to Egypt, right? That refers to Israel making treaties with Egypt, right? Oh, maybe if we buddy up to Egypt and pay them money, then Assyria won't come and attack us, right? Obviously, that didn't work out for them, but, A plus for the effort, I guess. But in chapter 8, the language that's used, right, it says, they shall return to Egypt. This is an intentional reference back to the Exodus from Egypt, right? God's essentially warning Israel that, right, they're going to go back into captivity. As we know it, standing on this side of history, right, that happened, right? It didn't happen with Egypt. It happened with Assyria, but it did happen. And just as they were enslaved by the Egyptians, right, now, they're going to be essentially enslaved by the Assyrians. This is a quote talking about that. It says, this is a reversal of the Exodus and implies a removal from the land and a nullification of covenant promises. As for the right sort of covenant promises aspect, Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 68 actually lists this as a curse for disobedience to God. It says, the Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt. That word can also mean Lamentations, which probably makes more sense because you didn't really travel to Egypt by ships, or Assyria for that matter. But the Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt on a journey I said you should never make again. There you will offer yourselves for sale to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you, right? So where we're at in the time of Hosea is, and you're going to see this a lot tonight, a lot of the stuff that is listed as, okay, you break the covenant, this is going to happen to you. Or just straight up prophecy of like, at the end of Moses' life, God's saying, okay, one of these days the people are going to, be idolatrous, and they're going to take a bunch of paganism and mix it with, worship of me and all this stuff. and the priesthoods are going to become corrupt, and the kings are going to be corrupt, and all this stuff. And here's what's going to happen. And we see in Hosea the fulfillment of that. Or at least Hosea is coming onto the scene and saying, hey, just as this was prophesied back then, I'm prophesying it to you again. But unlike the time of Moses, it's about to happen. It's very imminent. And you'll see that a lot here in chapter 8. So, getting into the whole golden, or not even, it doesn't even necessarily say golden, but just the whole calf thing. Kind of skipping over the first 3 verses, and then verse 4, they set up kings, but not by me. They made princes, but I did not acknowledge them. We already kind of covered that. From their silver and gold, they made idols for themselves, that they might be cut off. So, the first half of verse 5, right after that, it says, your calf is rejected, O Samaria. Or another way to translate this would be, I reject the calf or the bull of Samaria. So, in addition to, there's the call back to the Exodus that's going on. There's also, right, like I kind of just hinted at, this is all deeply rooted in problems in Hosea's time. Hosea kind of picks up on, okay, the covenantal curses that Moses talked about, that's about to be applied. Oh, the prophecy that y'all are going to mess up big, that's happening now. And the punishments that were also prophesied are about to be applied. But it's all rooted in what's happening in Hosea's time, or even before Hosea's time, but it's sort of still in effect. So 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 28 through 30. Our old pal Jeroboam II, if you remember in the prologue of Hosea, there is one king of Israel listed, and it is Jeroboam the son of Joash. So, right, because then after that is when you have all of the constant turnover of kings, right? I'm going to kill you and take power, and then 6 months later, someone's going to kill me and take power. So, 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 28 through 30. After seeking advice, the king, Jeroboam II, made 2 golden calves. He said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. One he set up in Bethel, and the other in Dan. And this thing became a sin. The people came to worship the one at Bethel and went as far to Dan to worship the other. So, this is, probably the most obvious example of this religious syncretism that we've been talking about. Of, okay, well, I'm going to take a little bit of something that's true and a little bit of something that's false and kind of blend it together, right? If you remember from week 1, there were, like anything in the Bible, different ways to date the different kings. So one of the people who attempted to date the kings that we referenced, his name was William Albright. In addition to doing a lot of chronology of Israel, he also was really influential in just biblical archaeology and sort of the history of the Old Testament especially. And so he actually wrote, among Canaanites, among Arameans, and among Hittites, we find the gods nearly always represented as standing on the back of an animal or as seated on a throne borne by animals, but never as themselves in animal form. So why am I bringing this up? Why is this important? Well, right, the golden calf of Aaron, this is your blank thing, the golden calf of Aaron from Exodus, and the 2 the 2 golden calves of Jeroboam II were not meant to be images of God themselves. Rather, they were meant to be the dwelling place of God. So, right, a lot of times we think that, well, the golden calf was, supposed to, well, you have, I got my little statue of Buddha, and this is supposed to represent Buddha. And we think that that's kind of like what the golden calf was of I've got my little golden calf, and that's supposed to represent God. Likely not the case, necessarily. Likely, the calf was supposed to be where God would come down and dwell. Similar to the Ark of the Covenant, right? It's this object that essentially could summon God. Obviously, it didn't work out like they thought it would, but that was the idea anyway. So if that's the case, if right, it was meant to be the dwelling place of God, it's this religious syncretism thing that we've been talking about so much, right? True worship. Israel wants God to dwell with them, right? False worship, God does not dwell somewhere simply because you want him to, right? God does not, right? You can't really summon God like that. It doesn't work like that. And even if it did, you shouldn't do that, as we'll get into later. There were prescribed methods for worship, and this was not one of them. So, we have, the whole golden calf thing from Jeroboam, which is still likely in effect in the time of Hosea, right? They made idols for themselves that they might be cut off. Your calf is rejected, O Samaria, my anger is aroused against them. And then verse 6, the calf of Samaria shall be broken to pieces, right? Again, this whole concept of religious syncretism. Moving on into sowing and reaping. In verse 7, this is where we get mention of this. It says, they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. The stalk has no bud, it shall never produce meal. If it should produce, aliens should swallow it up. So, y'all have all been here for the most, part, all of the study of the minor prophets, or at least a good majority of it. And, we're definitely no strangers to hyperbolized, emphasizing sin. Sorry, I've lost my place for a moment. So, right, this is also a covenantal curse here, this whole sowing and reaping thing. So, your first, your blank is these same aliens, the Assyrians, will soon swallow up not only Israel's agriculture, but Israel herself. So agriculture and then Israel herself. If you remember when we were in Joel, well, first let me say this. So this is a covenantal curse. We get this from Deuteronomy 28, verse 38. Again, going back to this whole, right, what Moses talked about is still happening or is about to happen. Deuteronomy 28:38, you will sow much seed in the field, but you will harvest little, because locusts will devour it. So, okay, locust and the devouring thing, that's a covenantal curse. If you remember Joel, we had locusts, and, the locust of chapter 1, verse 4, and chapter 2, 25, right, they were symbols for Babylon that would come in and just devour everything, right? Including Israel's agriculture. Joel describes it in chapter 1, verse 4. It says, what the chewing locust has left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust left, the crawling locust has eaten. And what the crawling locust left, the consuming locust has eaten. So, the locusts that Joel describes, were these aliens that were quite literally devouring Israel's agriculture, right? So similarly in Hosea chapter 8, we see this, promised fulfillment. It wouldn't take very long to get there, but still, this promised fulfillment of the covenantal curse of Deuteronomy 28:38. You sow much in the seed, you sow much seed in the field, you harvest little because locusts devour it. And we see, in Hosea, these aliens are going to swallow up Israel's agriculture. And then in verse 8, it says, not only that, but Israel also is swallowed up. Right? How so? How does this happen? Well, it says, now they are among the Gentiles, like a vessel in which there is no pleasure. So, and then in verse 9, it directly mentions Assyria. So Israel, right, they're relying on these aliens or these foreigners for protection, but it's going to come back to bite them because, again, you're fill in the blank thing. These same aliens or foreigners, the Assyrians, will swallow up not only Israel's agriculture, but also Israel herself, right? And I mean, yeah, we see that in the narrative of the Assyrian conquest. So moving on, looking at verse 11. Verse 11 says, sorry, my page flipped apparently, and I was in Hosea chapter 12. I was very confused. Verse 11, because Ephraim has made many altars for sin, they have become for him altars for sinning. This is where I meant to go with this thought earlier, right? We're no strangers to hyperbolized forms of, descriptions of sinning in the minor prophets. You know, a lot of the times, both Israel and Judah, the minor prophets will just say, the wackiest things about, in an attempt to describe the manner in which they're sinning or the level of their sin. I mean, even in Hosea last week, we saw in the same verse that it says, they do not consider in their hearts that I remember wickedness. The end of verse 2, they are before my face, or literally their wickedness is before my face. So, right, I mean, Israel's wickedness is so bad that it's literally piled its way up to heaven, essentially. So, I mean, we're familiar with this sort of hyperbolized language describing sin. Hosea announces that Israel herself has become an altar to false gods, right? I mean, between the religious syncretism and the paganism and the idolatry and all this stuff that was so commonplace in Israel, right? It's almost as if Israel itself is just one ginormous altar to Baal, or fill in the blank with whatever false god you want to put in here. 1 Kings chapter 12, right after what we just read a little bit ago with Jeroboam II and the whole golden calf thing, in verses 31 to 33, it says, Jeroboam built shrines on high places and appointed priests from all sorts of people, even though they were not Levites. He instituted a festival on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the festival held in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. This he did in Bethel, sacrificing to the calves he had made. And at Bethel he also installed priests at the high places he had made. On the 15th day of the 8th month, a month of his own choosing, he offered sacrifices on the altar he had built at Bethel. So he instituted the festival for the Israelites and went up to the altar to make offerings. So, again, I mean, yeah, you have, the sowing and reaping thing that we pointed out, right? I mean, that's sort of a fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28:38. Getting back up into, the Exodus thing that we talked about at the very beginning. I mean, Deuteronomy 28:68, the Lord will send you back in ships to Egypt. I mean, that's a reference, back to Deuteronomy. I mean, we have a lot of references back to the covenantal curses that were given to Moses. Hey, if you follow the covenant, here's all the blessings you're going to receive. If you don't follow the covenant, here's all the curses you're going to receive. But in Hosea, right, it's not just calling back to Moses. It's deeply rooted in the history of what's going on in Israel at the time of Hosea. And it's the same thing, right? You have these golden calves from Jeroboam that are still kind of a thing in the time of Hosea, apparently. And also these, right, altars that Jeroboam set up as well. It says he built shrines on high places. Excuse me. And here's the thing. I mean, he did this, it said in the set of verses I read before, because he thought, oh, I don't want to make people travel all the way to Jerusalem, right? You kind of read this and you think, oh, that's like a nice gesture, right? I don't want to make people travel that far to go to church, so to speak. I'll just build a thing right here, right? Same thing here. I mean, he builds these altars or these shrines on high places. He even appoints some priests. You're like, oh, that's nice, right? You know, it's like if you've ever been to, uh, like a museum or something, and one of those like living history things. It's like, oh, this is like the next best thing, right? If I can't be there, if I can't be in, World War One Germany or whatever, I'll just go to this museum and have some guy pretend to be, World War One German, and it's the next best thing, right? It's kind of that. It's like you're building almost a replica or a cheap knockoff. You kind of feel for him in a little bit. He institutes priests. That's good. In human terms, we're going to give him a point for that. But they're not Levites, it says, so that's a mark against them. He instituted a festival, it says, like the festival held in Judah. So once again, I mean, he's doing this, I don't want to make people go all the way to Jerusalem, all the way to Judah. He even offered sacrifices on it as well, right? All these things like what you would see in Jerusalem, like what you would see in Judah. And so all this, right, it's rooted in a historical context. Right, these altars, these shrines, they were abundant. Even altars and shrines that in some capacity, probably a limited one, but some capacity, right, were, being used to worship God. So what was the problem? And this is your blank. What was the problem? A complete disregard for the manner in which God should be worshipped. Right. God is not separate from the religious practices that he himself ordained. And I know I've said that before, probably the exact same way I just said it now, but it's because it's true. Here's the thing. I'm not one of these people that like just tries to pick apart different phrases and stuff. But like, you hear people say it's not a religion, it's a relationship, which is true. But like, I think that you shouldn't just say stuff like that. I think you should explain what you mean, because I mean, there's still a code of conduct when it comes to worshiping God, and there's still a set of religious practices. I mean, it's not, in the same way like we talked about last week with the whole very individualized religion that sort of spun out of like Baal worship. I mean, there is still very much like, a code of conduct when it comes to how God should be worshipped, even in the new covenant that we live in today, right? I mean, this is why if you go to a church where like everyone is screaming, running around, and like speaking languages that don't exist, you can point to that passage where Paul talks about order and worship and say, y'all are doing it wrong, right? And you would have a good biblical footing to do that. There is a manner in which God should be worshipped, and that was even more so the case under the Old Covenant and the time in which Hosea was living, right? Jeroboam and then Israel as a whole, even in the time of Hosea, they had a complete disregard for the prescribed model of worship, right? They thought, well, we'll just get the next best thing. We can't, or we don't want to anyway, go to Jerusalem. We'll make Jerusalem in the northern kingdom. We'll make a Jerusalem in Semethel. We'll make a Jerusalem in Bethel. We'll make a Jerusalem in Samaria, right? Our little living history museum of what Jerusalem is like. No, right? Right. The manner of worship needs to be just as important as, right, the worship itself, which, by the way, the worship itself was not, it's not as if, I don't mean to imply that like, that was the only thing that was wrong here. It's just that they weren't worshiping in Jerusalem. And every other thing about what they were doing was like completely biblical. Because I mean, obviously you still have all these pagan influences that are influencing, how they're worshiping. You know, I mean, you have temple prostitution going on, which obviously would be forbidden, you know, in the Mosaic law. But, you know, it's the manner in which we should worship God as well as the worship itself. In verse 12, this is sort of explicitly stated that they had no regard for the model of worship. It says, I have written for him the great things of my law, but they were considered a strange thing, right? You know, God's like, hey, Ephraim, verse 11, you've made many altars. You've become an altar for sinning. Verse 12, I've written for you the great things of my law, but they're considered strange, right? You know, they don't have a regard for the manner in which God has prescribed worship to be done. So much so that, like, if someone were to actually come and tell them, hey, you shouldn't be doing this, they'd be like, well, why not? That's weird. That's strange that you say that, right? They're that far removed from actually living out the covenant. Deuteronomy chapter 12. This is, go ahead and turn there, Deuteronomy 12, because this is kind of long. But I mean, this really hits home onto like why this was such a big deal. Because we might think of this, you know, like today. I mean, we don't have a Jerusalem, right? We don't have like a centralized place of worship in the same sense that they did. So we're like, I can worship in Talala, I can worship at Ulaga, I can go worship on Mount Rushmore. Like, what difference does it make? But Deuteronomy chapter 12, and I'm going to start in verse 4. So it says, you shall not worship the Lord your God with such things. And we'll talk about what that means in a minute. But you shall seek the place where the Lord your God chooses out of all your tribes to put his name for his dwelling place, and there you shall go. There you shall take your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, your vowed offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. And there you shall eat before the Lord your God, and you shall rejoice in all to which you have put your hand, you and your households, in which the Lord your God has blessed you. You shall not at all do as we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For as yet you have come to the rest and inheritance for which the Lord is giving you. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God has given you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so you dwell in safety, then there will be the place where the Lord your God chooses to make his name abide. There you shall bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the heave offerings of your hand, and all the choice offerings which you vow to the Lord. You shall rejoice before the Lord your God, and your sons and your daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levite who is within your gates, since he has no portion nor inheritance with you. Take heed to yourself that you do not offer your burnt offerings in every place that you see, but in the place which the Lord chooses in one of your tribes, there you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there you shall do all that I command you. So he's saying, okay, look, right now, you just offer wherever, because you haven't come into the land of promise yet, right? It hasn't been revealed to you where this is going to be. But in that time, when it's revealed to you, right, you're in the land of the promise, the place you're going to inherit, you're safe from all your enemies, all that, he's going to tell you, this is where the worship needs to be done, right? Then backing up and reading the first 4 verses, okay, which you might think, why did I do that to begin with? It says, these are all the statutes and judgments which you shall be careful to observe in the land which the Lord your God of your fathers is giving you to possess all the days you live on the earth. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall dispose serve their gods, on the high mountains, on the hills, and under every green tree. You shall destroy their altars, break their sacred pillars, and burn their wooden images with fire. You shall cut down their carved images of their gods and destroy their names from that place. So, okay, Israel, like we said, it's the manner in which God should be worshipped. Why was this such a big deal? Because God specifically said, when you come into the land of promise and when it's revealed to you where you're going to worship, that's where you need to worship. Okay? But even beyond that, right? This whole concept of just place an altar wherever you want to and worship God comes from these pagan religions, right? So even this is another example of this blending of religions, right? A little bit of what's right and a little bit of what's wrong, and we're going to throw it together and see what sticks, right? You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations which you shall dispose serve their gods, right? Where was that? On the high mountains, on the hills, right? Where did Jeroboam make his shrines? It says on the high places, right? So, I mean, even if these were, the Jeroboam shrines I'm talking about, even if these were completely in every other aspect orthodox shrines, right? Everything we do is perfectly in line with the method of worship that God prescribes. It still would be wrong, right? And because God said, right, this is how you worship and this is where you worship. And even this idea of this stems out of paganism. So, I mean, even then, you're still caught up in this syncretizing of religion, right? All of this, again, is besides the fact that it says in verse 11 of Hosea chapter 8 that Ephraim has made altars for sin. So, yeah, I mean, even besides the location of these altars, I mean, they're clearly altars in which sin is occurring, right? It's not just like, oh, we come here and we pray and we make sacrifices and we sing Kumbaya and the only thing wrong is our location, right? No, I mean, there is the location, but also, yeah, they are definitely other things happening. Final section, a forgotten maker. I will say the other thing where it just says C, and then there's 2 dots on altars for sinning is Deuteronomy 12. So, right, for more context, basically, see Deuteronomy 12. For a forgotten maker, the little C right there, that bullet point, is Deuteronomy 35. So Deuteronomy 35, and we're only going to read 3 verses, so I'm just going to go ahead and read it. Jeshurun, or Israel essentially, grew fat and kicked. Filled with food, they became heavy and sleek. They abandoned the God who made them and rejected the rock their savior. They made him jealous with their foreign gods and angered him with their detestable idols. They sacrificed to false gods which are not God, gods they had not known, gods that recently appeared, gods your ancestors did not fear. You deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot the God who gave you birth. So we see a lot here that's very similar to Hosea. Made God jealous with foreign gods? Check. Detestable idols? Check. Sacrificing to false gods? Check. Right? Gods your ancestors did not fear. Gods they had not known? Check. Right? And then this whole, you deserted the rock who fathered you. You forgot the God who gave you birth. Right? Well, I mean, look at Hosea, right? Verse 14, Hosea 8:14, for Israel had forgotten his maker, right? Sorry, my mistake. Yeah, but Israel has forgotten his maker, right? Or as it says in Deuteronomy, you deserted the rock that fathered you, the God who gave you birth, right? Going on, it says Israel has built temples, right? They have forgotten that his maker, Israel, has built temples. Judah also has multiplied fortified cities, right? What we just read in Deuteronomy 32, it said, talking about the foreign gods, the detestable idols, all of this. Here in Hosea, it just says, right, you build temples, or also could be palaces. And so maybe temples of worship, maybe palaces of kings. In either case, from these locations either came direct idol worship, or kings who initiated idol worship, or kings who were complacent in idol worship. And so the kings and princes were established and acknowledged by God. This is your second bullet point. The kings and princes were established and acknowledged. That should obviously this should be were not established and not acknowledged by God. I don't know why I didn't include that. Were not established and not acknowledged by God. Therefore, Israel could hardly trust in any palace for leadership or protection during the time of God's wrath, right? So, you have, okay, well, you've forgotten the rock that fathered you, or as Hosea says, you've forgotten your maker. Deuteronomy, it says, you have the foreign gods, the detestable idols, the false gods, all of this. Hosea, it says you're building temples, you're building palaces, right? And so if it is palaces and it's more of like a house, like a White House kind of thing, then, right, well, it already said in Hosea chapter 8, the kings and princes weren't established and weren't acknowledged by God. So when this wrath of God comes, at the very end of verse 14, it says, I will send fire upon the cities and devour his palaces. When that happens, you can hardly trust in the palaces, if that's the idea, because the kings aren't ordained by God, right? The God doesn't even acknowledge the kings or the princes. If the idea is temple or altars, right, the priests already have had their judgment prophesied against them, right? Hosea chapter 4, verses 7 through 10, it says, the more priests that were there, the more they sinned against me, right? They exchanged their glorious God for something disgraceful. They feed on the sins of my people and relish their wickedness. And it will be like people, like priests. I will punish both of them for their ways and repay for their deeds. They will eat but not have enough. They will engage in prostitution but not flourish because they have deserted the Lord. So if the idea is temples and places of worship, right? This is your second little fill in the blank. The priests already have judgment prophesied against them. So Israel could hardly trust in any temples or altars to save them from this fiery judgment of God that we read about. So whatever is being burned up, whether it's temples or palaces or cities, as it talks about with Judah, right? It doesn't bode well for Israel, right? Deuteronomy 32, a little bit later in that chapter, verses 21 and 22, it says, they made me jealous by what is no God. Very similar to what we've seen in Hosea. And angered me with their worthless idols. Again, very similar. I will make them envious by those who are not a people. I will make them angry by a nation that has no understanding. For a fire will be kindled by my wrath, one that burns down to the realm of the dead below. It will devour the earth and its harvests, and set afire the foundation of the mountains. So, okay, those who are not a people, a nation that has no understanding. Okay, that's the Gentiles. And in, the context of Hosea, okay, Assyria, check, right? A fire will be kindled by my wrath. Well, Hosea chapter 8, the very end, it specifically talks about this fire. So we got that for a check. Also, we know that when Assyria and pretty much every other country at that time, and for most of history, right, came in and started, right, conquesting, if I can make that a verb, conquering all these nations and cities, what did they do? Anything that's going to burn, we're going to light it on fire, right? We've even been doing this relatively recently in human history, right? We're going to go burn Atlanta or whatever, that wasn't that long ago, all things considered. A lot of references to Deuteronomy, either the covenantal curses or predictions of Israel's eventual idolatry and the consequences of that. And Hosea is coming in and saying, hey, this didn't go away. These curses are still in effect. And everything that it's describing a curse for, y'all are doing, right? And these curses are about to be fulfilled in a very short time. So, right, the time of judgment is very imminent. But as we've also seen, it's all rooted in the historical context of Hosea with Jeroboam II and the syncretism. Any questions or anything? Any blanks or things that I need to go back over?
I missed one.
Which one?
altars for sinning. Complete disregard for the.
manner in which God should be worshipped.
I must have blanked out there.
No worries. Okay. I forgot to pick up a prayer thing from the table outside. So I will be right back.